Justin Rose, the author of the project, and you are
My name's Michael Hyman, and I composed the music score.
awesome. Yeah, I think you did about 20 or 21 tracks on it. Fabulous work. Where are you from?
I live just outside London, in a little town called Loughton, which is in the county of Essex.
You know what? I think one of the other people who worked on the project actually had an address. Is it spelled Leigh?
No, that might you might be thinking of Leighton, which is
Okay.
Leyton, which isn't actually far away from it.
Okay, I think
But
one of the actors is from there.
oh, fantastic! That's literally 15 minutes away from here, so it's not far.
That's super cool. How long have you been composing for?
About 15 years, professionally. Before that, I was studying, but yeah, professionally about 15 years. Yeah.
So where did you study? What was your educational background in it?
So I did a master's in composition for screen at the Royal College of Music, which is in London. I suppose before that, I was just kind of doing a generic music undergrad, and it got towards the end of that degree, and I had to suddenly think of, oh, well, what am I going to do next? And I thought I really wanted to be a composer of some kind, but kind of modern day classical contemporary concert composition is often kind of takes music off in quite new and kind of experimental tangents. Whereas I wanted to kind of find a way that I could keep doing your more kind of traditional melodic composition like you would find in film scoring. So I was drawn towards composition for screen, composition for film, because that was a kind of a vehicle which would allow me to compose in the way that I wanted to compose. And that's what kind of sucked me into this world, and drew me towards doing my masters in that discipline at one of the best places to do it, the Royal College of Music, which was an awful lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. And so, clearly you just play several different instruments. I believe, were you the one who sang in the trailer song in there?
I did sing in the
Yes.
trailer.
So you had general music education. You clearly very good singer, talented musician. Um, was there ever a time when you were considering going more the performative route, or was it always in your head that you were like, some composition is where my joy is?
I mean, when I was a lot younger, I was a performing artist to a certain extent, not in classical music, more of a kind of alternative singer-songwriter genres of music. So I did tour for a little while to a limited extent, when I was kind of 23, 24, 25. Um, and I suppose that feeds in a little bit to what, you come back to the trailer, the kind of that fusion between filmic cinematic music and song kind of is quite encapsulated in that trailer track. And so I suppose my experience in doing that fed into, singing on the trailer and the song that actually exists there. In terms of classical music performance, I don't think that was ever going to be an option simply because when I was a child, I never practiced enough. So it was never my, I don't think it was ever my calling or my desire or my discipline to say practice the piano, practice the cello, practice the guitar for as long as I would have needed to kind of be a successful performance artist in those disciplines. I think I was always going to be drawn to something that was music creation, because that's where I really came to my fore, kind of using my ears, listening, kind of drawing upon all of those influences that I've always had in my life. I think it was always going to be that route rather than practice 6 hours a day and be, a world famous touring pianist.
Sure. Yeah, it's two different even though they're so related, it also is in some ways two different worlds, it seems like, like the skill sets you need and the interests and mindset you would need to have. Were you able to enter composition shortly out of school, or was there kind of like an in-between gradual process where you moved that direction, or how did that work?
In terms of kind of professionally, I mean, it's still a progress. It's always a gradual work in progress, kind of climbing to where you want to be with this. Um, it depends what you mean. I've always been a composer to a certain degree, straight out of school. Could I solely earn a living from it straight away is a completely different question. And the answer to that question would be no. But I think I've always been professionally involved in music. I didn't have a day job, so to speak, that was completely unrelated. But what I did do early on was I had a lot of teaching. So I taught piano, cello, composition, general kind of music theory at various institutions and music schools for quite a long time, probably for about a decade, until I was in my kind of early to mid 30s. I did a lot of that. And even now, I'm now an assistant professor of composition for screen at the Royal College of Music, which is where I
Oh,
did
that's cool.
master's degree. Um,
Come full
but
circle in a way.
yeah, absolutely. It's a lovely circle, but I do that because I enjoy it. I don't do it because I necessarily have to for the money. It's a quite a nice role to have. But early on, as fantastic as teaching was, it undeniably was also there because I had to earn a living. But so I try to make my professional life about music always, but it definitely is a gradual climb in terms of being able to earn a living purely from composition, and that is a work in progress for most composers for quite a long while.
Would assume like I mean I've looked at some of your credits and stuff online, and you've worked on several of these very legitimate movies and different things and such, but I would assume there's always going to be a bit of a sway where the type of projects that are available at different points will kind of a feast or famine thing, like I would assume that's probably always there in those creative fields.
It is absolutely. I mean, right now I've been super busy at the beginning of this year with Fall of Ingway, but not just that. I've had two other films that I've been working on. One of which I'm just kind of getting to the end of now, um, as well as a couple of other things that might be coming up in early March. So, but you're right. But there are other times where there isn't much going on for 2, 3, 4 months in a row. So it is difficult to kind of get excited and take your foot off the gas because you're always kind of planning for those famine times, as you quite correctly put. So yeah, it's been a great start to the year, but it's never even, which is one of those things. From a creative point of view, it's not awful because in those downtimes you can actually use that to work on your own music. I release music to streaming platforms as well, so I've got my own projects. But in terms of a kind of professional financial stability point of view, yeah, there's definitely kind of peaks and troughs constantly along the way.
Sure. Are you able to share what the two films you've been working on are, or is that like under wraps?
I can't say too much at the moment. Right now, I'm working on a science fiction drama about I can't really get too much into the plot, but just to say it's a kind
Fair.
of
I know it's kind of like
yeah,
iffy whether or
it's
not,
difficult. Which the funny thing is, it's kind of in a way from some elements are similar to, as in there are some strings in there, but apart from that, the kind of sound set is so far away from Fall of Ingway. It's quite funny because it's all quite electronic and
Oh, sure.
synth and pulse based with the strings, whereas Fall of Ingway wouldn't have had any of that in it. It was really kind of traditional epic orchestral scoring.
So if you're working on two projects at the same time that are like that, where you have, one that's this classical old world orchestra sound and one that's like a modern synth scientific sound. Is it easier or more difficult to work on multiple pieces that are that different? Like, is it easier to separate them, or is it harder to get into two different frames of mind?
Mhm. I mean, for me personally, I am never a massive fan of having to work on multiple projects at the same time. Just because of my brain, the way my brain works. I do it because I have to. I'm not going to turn down work. As you say, that feast and famine thing. I can't really turn down work. If I had my perfect world, I'd spend all of January on this one project and then, all of February on this other one project, and it would be completely even like that. And I would never have to, split my brain in that way. But, it doesn't work out that way and you have to. But so what I tend to do is kind of try to dedicate days of the week. So if let's just say on Monday and Tuesday, I would solely be working on cues and themes for Fall of Ingway. And then on Wednesday, I would then just switch my brain over to this sci-fi film and just dedicate that day to that. So I think as long as I am kind of I'm giving each of the projects their own time, their own day and buffer zone. It doesn't adversely affect me. I can jump on board and immerse myself. I think for me, it's just about immersing myself in that current time in that project. So it would be difficult for me to say, okay, 10 to 11, I'm going to work on Fall of Ingway, and then 11 to 12, I'm going to go and jump on the sci-fi film. I don't think I could really be able to jump that easily between because my brain would still be kind of running over the music from the last project. But as long as I think I at least split it up day by day, then that's okay.
Interesting. So what is your process like for writing? Like step by step, kind of like, do you start usually with a melody or a mood, or do you pick a particular instrument or ensemble of instruments that you want to work in, or how does that usually kick off for a particular piece?
It could vary. So, for example, the amazing thing about Fall of Ingwe was that you got me writing so many themes. I wasn't necessarily, looking at a film and deciding at 32 seconds this has to come in, and at 43 seconds and working it out surgically like that, which you sometimes have to when you're kind of working with picture. It was more, you know, 21 or however many it was themes to write, and that's fantastic because it just allows me to initially emancipate myself from the computer. I go over to my piano and I just think about this person, whoever it is that I'm writing the theme for. What are they all about? And I start thinking about the different sides of their character, what I want to represent in the theme. And then, as you say, I'll sit at the piano and I'll just start playing either a chord sequence or a melody, and just to start getting that sorry, in a really old school kind of way, really away from the computer system, away from the software, the hardware, just sitting down at the piano and just coming up with music that represents this person or this place. And then once I've done that, I'll then go to the computer, I'll take a look at the script and say, well, just to check that what I've written is not just tallying in with the character of this person, but also tallying in with what I can see is going on at some point when
Mhm.
the theme is due to be played. And then I'll sculpt it a little bit more, work on the structure of those themes, making sure that there are enough kind of fully enclosed sections to give you some options to work with. And then I'll get into my computer software and I'll orchestrate it and produce the audio for everything.
So when you're when you're writing that, or when you're originally performing that piece, kind of like working it out on the piano, do you have in your head usually kind of an idea of what other elements are going to be coming in at different points? Or is it more solely the melody on the piano that you're working on, and then when you get to the computer, you start figuring out, okay, now what other elements could I introduce to enrich or make this more complex? Like, how does that usually progress?
So I'll normally have some kind of idea from when I'm writing it, what I want the orchestration to be. So it all comes back to what happens at the piano. But you're right. When I get to the computer, I will then enrich it more and more and more as you're going along. So as I said, I'll have an idea that, oh, okay, these are going to be held strings here at the beginning. I just know that, or maybe it will be horns or brass or something, depending on, who it is. I'll kind of have an idea what instruments will be involved, but it won't be until I've actually started that recording and producing process at the computer that I'll kind of really know, is that enough? What else am I going to add? How am I going to get this to its full state? So it's a dual thing. It's both kind of knowing in the composition process at the piano, but also then enriching and adding when you're in the production software to really get it to where it's going to eventually be.
Interesting. And about how much of the music would you say in the final product is live instruments versus electronic? Because it seemed like there were more instruments to my expectation that sounded live. Like I know you brought in a violinist for a lot of the violin work, and the piano, I believe, was you're playing and stuff. But some of the other instruments also, I was like, it would surprise me a lot if this was done digitally. I mean, it's impressive what is done digitally, but it would have surprised me if it was. About how much would you say goes either way?
Um, you'll be surprised. It's virtually all digital. There's only two
Really?
things in the entire score that's live. So the violin is live, and the cello, the lower solo string instrument that's in a few cues, that's me playing. That's live as well. Everything else is a digital instrument.
That's incredible. I would not have expected that, and I am really impressed that it's able to sound that whole. It's
Well,
kind of cool.
a lot of these sample libraries, they did start off with being real people. So a lot of the orchestral ones, the piano ones, these were real orchestras and real pianos actually recorded note by note in a studio somewhere. And that's what actually becomes these digital libraries. So they, is based on real people playing. That's why it's so realistic.
Yeah, but I mean, just like the different volume and timing of the different notes, the way it all flows together, that's got to be really complex to be able to have that many different forms of each particular note, Like that's pretty cool.
That's the skill. You can, there's a saying, there's a negative saying, in lots of fields about people who have loads of technology but can't use it. Um, all the gear but no idea. And I think that kind of plays into this. You have to know how to use these things. So, as you say, all the different kind of volume levels and the different timbres that you can kind of control with these instruments is there's quite a lot of variety there, but you need to know how to do it. And that's, I've been doing this for 15 years now, and that's why I know how to do it.
And so I guess clearly they weren't used in the production then, but what different instruments do you play? I know you mentioned cello and piano, clearly singing.
So yeah, I tend to have solo cello a lot in my in my music for obvious reasons because
Yeah.
it's lovely to have live music as part of what you do, and if you can play it yourself, then all the better. So I'll often have cello. If there's scores that need guitar, electric guitar, bass guitar, I can I'll probably play those as well. For example, so sometimes, if it's appropriate, we'll have. Oops, sorry, just smashing the microphone on my way back down.
It's all good.
We'll have those in there as well, and as you say, voice sometimes. So yeah, I play guitars, voice, cello, piano. I mean, you could kind of say the piano is live in a way, but it's still a digital piano. But it is me performing on it. So
Sure.
yeah.
Okay. And do you find it easier to write in the instruments that you yourself play or are more familiar with, or is there a range of instruments that are like in your wheelhouse that you really prefer to go back to, or are you pretty broad in what you're willing to incorporate. I know I asked for some oddball instruments like a lute in one song and stuff. And like how much does that affect your composition reaching out to those different instruments?
It's fine. I mean, I think stylistically, to be honest with you, what we did in this project is my favorite thing to do in all the world, and the thing that I find most comfortable to do, which is working with orchestral instruments. um I am fine with working with electronic textures as well, and sometimes you have to do that, and I do like that. But where I'm most comfortable is working with, just fully blown orchestra, where I don't have to necessarily worry about the sound production like you have to when you're working with more electronic instruments. Coming back to the lute and things like that, I mean, I think the most important thing in this job is having such a wide experience of music that you've listened to, that if somebody asks you to do something like that, it's fine. You just turn your hand to it and you find an instrument that is going to fit what they want, and you write something for it. So that wasn't massively a problem. In fact, it was quite fun. I enjoyed doing some of the lute based. It would be fantastic if I knew a real kind of lute player. That would, I think, take it to the next level. But I think what I used, which was actually a mandolin sound, came across quite well.
I guess I'm not familiar enough with the different instruments to tell the difference, but the
Well, I think
sound.
that's exactly the point. I think that with that kind of sound, is you get away with it could be anything, and quite a lot of things you do when you're looking for that um medievally world sound is it is the point. It is ambiguous. Is it a lute? Is it a mandolin? You don't. It doesn't really matter. I happen to use a mandolin sound, but I didn't use a mandolin because I necessarily envisaged them playing a mandolin. It was just the vehicle for them playing their medieval stringed instrument, whatever that may be.
And I mean, the sound of it, the style of it was far and away medieval. I mean, it didn't sound like, here in America we have mandolins used a lot in like Southern music, like traditional
Right.
Southern music. And it didn't sound like that at all. It sounded like that high kind of like court bard playing, like I actually, the song "A Brow Not Meant for Crowns" that it's featured heavily in was one of the ones in your composition that I just really, really liked. It was very simple compared to some of the other ones as far as how many elements or whatever was going on, but the effect it had just nailed the sound of the world.
Oh, I appreciate that, and I think it was a lot of fun to do because I really like the fact that initially it was actually a diegetic performance, so it was supposed to be somebody really playing that within the scene, and then it transforms itself into more background music after that. So it was lovely to encapsulate that sense of somebody really would be playing this in your created world, which was a lot of fun.
So you've talked about your process a bit. How much has that changed over time? And is it in a steady state of change from project to project, or have you found over the years that you've kind of settled into a groove of approaching projects where the way you write and everything kind of flows along the same template?
Yeah, I think it's stayed fairly similar. I would say it's more kind of evolving in a tweaked kind of way. So as I go along, I might, over the years, I might change my mind in terms of the way I produce music, I suppose, more than writing. Um, what I mean by that is just the overall sound. I don't want to get too technical, but in terms of the frequencies and how bassy I suppose I like something versus how more clean or cleaner trebly sound that I might like. I suppose those tastes of mine in terms of the way the product ends up sounding, that kind of changes a little bit more over the years rather than the composing itself. But I suppose I get influenced just like everybody else does. So you'll hear something that you really like, and you might incorporate that into your music for a little while, and then you might go back to something else. So more often than not, just because of the stylistic realities of 2024 and film, I'm often working with some really sonorous electronic synth sounds that I mix with things like strings and orchestral sounds. It was actually a rare treat with Fall of Ingway. Like I actually got to go back to using purely orchestral sounds because it's, it's a fantasy novel that wouldn't want, electronics really in there. So it's quite rare that I get the opportunity to really just enjoy that orchestral world purely. But that doesn't mean that I dislike using electronic instruments. I'm influenced by a lot of things and I enjoy the music that I write. It's just, getting back to that purely orchestral sound was a pleasure in terms of this project. So yeah, I do have a comfort zone in the way I compose and the way I construct things. And I suppose I will always, I think everybody does return to that style. You can move away, you can have different unique projects, but you'll always have your own voice. I don't think you can run from your voice. I think for a long time with film composition, I felt like, oh, maybe I should be more like that person. And then maybe next year I think, oh, maybe I should be more like that person, just because of what you're listening to that's, doing well at a current time. But I think you can't run from who you are. You will always write and come back to your own voice. And I think what you should be doing instead is embracing your own voice, looking how you can really get that voice to its optimum, to its peak, and make the most of the skills you have instead of, trying to be someone else from one year to the next year. Because, in my experience, that doesn't work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like I have a deep preference usually also for the more orchestral sounds. Like I mentioned several of my favorite soundtracks going into this to kind of get, kind of figure out an approach, and like Last Mohicans, Lord of the Rings, like these are the places that I really love. But then Chariots of Fire is a very electronic synth based soundtrack, and that's
Mhm.
also one of my favorites. So it's like occasionally like those electronic sounds can definitely hit a very very sweet spot of working also. Are there any particular composers that you would say had a big influence on you? I know you said it can vary from like the flow of what's in vogue as to what might be on your mind, but are there any particular composers who you're like, I really, really enjoy this person?
There's many people who I enjoy. They don't all necessarily influence my music because unfortunately, um, the way, if they're from a long time ago, the way they write just wouldn't, unfortunately, from a professional point of view, be suitable for writing film music these days. And it's sad, it's a shame, but it's just kind of the reality. So I really like, composers like Bernard Herrmann, who work a lot with Alfred Hitchcock on things like Psycho, The Birds, Vertigo, films like that, where you kind of felt every single note in a really uber dramatic way. It wouldn't be something that you can unfortunately do a lot these days with my own film music, but it certainly are people who I really truly enjoy listening to. From a more modern point of view, you mentioned Lord of the Rings. Well, I think Howard Shore is an incredible composer, and I think what he created there, across those 12 hours of film,
Right.
is almost, unrivaled in terms of his use of leitmotif. So that's in terms of using themes to create the entire score out of, basically. So that is always going to be a heavy influence on my thought process. But more recently, composers like Lorne Balfe, who has just recently taken over doing the latest Mission Impossible film, but has also done series on TV, things like The Wheel of Time, and also his Dark Materials, which is the Philip Pullman adaptation onto TV. So he's got a really varied stylistic palette, I think, from orchestral to more electronic and song-based scoring as well. And I really enjoy listening to him at the moment.
Nice. I'm not super familiar with him, but I have heard like some covers taken from his tune he wrote for the poem in you literally just mentioned the TV show. The Wheel of
Either
Time.
his
Like
Wheel of Time,
there's a
yeah.
song in the Wheel of Time called Wheat for Manetheren,
Yes,
and I
yes.
really liked the tune he created for that song. It sounded very, very fitting. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. What's great about that, it's ironic because I've spent the last 15 minutes talking about how much I enjoy it when I don't have to necessarily write electronic music. But actually, what's really great about that whole score is even though it's a fantasy TV series, because of the nature of it and the kind of vague, indeterminate use of time, the idea of time in the narrative thread in that actually there is quite a lot of ambient electronic and vocal song music that's involved, and it's a really interesting take on how to score a fantasy TV series.
okay. And so something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about writing themes versus writing for film, and then also came up a little bit when you're talking about the kind of the style used for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho or The Birds, is where you have kind of second by second in the production, the music ties into the elements on screen or in the script. If you were working on a project like this is something I've always wondered about. In a film like Baby Driver or one of these movies where the soundtrack is like tied almost like beat by beat, second by second into the film itself, who gets priority there and how do they usually arrange that? Like, would you get a cut of the film that has a second by second, showing what's happening, and then you have to fit your music to it, or would you write part of your music and then kind of like do the cutting and editing on the film to match it? How does that function usually?
Normally they will send me the edit and I would, if I wanted to make it super hit pointy like that, I would have to sort that out myself. It's just a clever use of tempos and time signature to make what you do exactly fit what you see on the screen. So they don't edit their films usually to the music, not to your music anyway. It's a frustrate can be a frustrating process because what can actually happen is that they will fit what's called temp music, which stands for temporary music, in their film. And they might have actually cut their film to that temporary existing track, which means when you come to write the actual real music, you have no choice but to follow the same tempos, the same hits as that temp music, because the scene has been cut to that music
Oh,
and you then have to
interesting.
do exactly the same thing as that. So that can be a bit frustrating. But normally you would make the hit points work with your music. But I'm not a huge fan and of really obvious disturbing hits in music. And actually, if you look at the good composers, even though it might seem like there's a lot of visual narrative hit points going on, they actually fuse it into the score really naturally and really cleverly. So you've got to find a way that it doesn't disturb the overall flow of your music. So you can't just randomly put things in wherever you want because your music would end up sounding like a ridiculous cacophony. You have got to make it so that your music, things that happen in the film actually synchronize with natural downbeat points in the music. So you can add something into the textures, something can happen that actually feels natural within the music score, but also hits that visual narrative that you see going on at the same time.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think like James Horner is probably a good example of that, where like all of his pieces feel like absolutely cohesive musical songs,
Yeah.
but also there are definite elements throughout like Lord of the Rings where the music is just fit like a glove to the scene, and it's cool that he's able to balance that so well. Uh, so in this project, I sent you a variety of instructions as far as like the level of detail it went to. Like some of them were as simple as just basically a mood and a possibility of an instrument, and then some of the other ones I really tried to get like as specific as I could with like, it needs to be, start off slow for this portion and then increase and either, stark and barren with just a couple instruments here or kind of like heavier orchestral build. And I tried to be as specific as I could on a couple of them. Which is preferable? Like when you're working on a project, do you like being able to just have free reign of doing comes to you, or do you like knowing, okay, I know exactly what this person's looking for, so I know my first shot is very likely to land in the expectations? Is there something that's easier either way?
What I need is for the director or the creator, whatever, whichever way they want to go, to be being honest with me. What I mean by that is, if you do have something really specific in your mind, the best thing is for you to tell me that. Don't be vague, but then actually, what I do is not what you had in your mind because you were vague in the first place. If you really honestly want to leave it up to me, then great, if that's what you wanted. But if you do have something that needs to happen, the clearer you can be about that, the better. So I suppose both, but in general, what's important is that we're on the same level. And I don't mean this in a kind of deceptive way. I mean this in a we just need to be clear with each other. If there is something specific that you need, be clear about what that is. And you were,
Makes a lot of sense.
you were totally clear. As you say, sometimes you gave me instructions for what you wanted to happen, and that's great because then I knew exactly what your expectations for that theme were going to be. And then other times, you kind of left it open, which is fine as well. But the worst thing is when people initially leave it open and then they end up having a huge problem with what you did because it wasn't anything like what they imagined in the first place. And then to them, I would say, well, if you were imagining something in the first place, then you needed to convey that to me instead of leaving it open and kind of almost not telling me that actually you really did have something that you wanted.
Makes a lot of sense. Kind of like clarity of expectations so that neither person's wasting their time. So when you received the script for the Fall of Ingway project, what was your first thought as far as impression? Like, was there anything that you thought immediately, okay, I would like to do this, or there's a particular mood here that I would like to try and work on? Was there anything that stood out that way?
Um, I think I really wanted to try to evoke emotion and really get behind the characters that were involved in the narrative. I think the first thing I did, by the way, was I read the whole script from beginning to end because I really felt like I wasn't willing to start writing any thematic material until I'd read the entire story, especially with something like, Ingway's theme being one of the first on the list. I didn't feel like I could possibly even begin to display in the music all the facets of his personality without reading the entire thing. So I felt it was really important to read the whole script from the beginning to the end, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I really felt like that gave me the toolkit to bring out the various sides of the characters, the human and immortal characters who are involved in this. And I think that was probably my biggest driving force, trying to really make this quite an emotive and empathetic journey that people go on in the audiobook and trying to be a part of that tapestry.
And that approach is really appreciated. Like when I was going back and forth with you, it was easy to tell that you were familiar with the material. Like, just the comments you were making about what you were considering, particularly with going to Ingway's theme, like, just in the emails we shared, you're mentioning aspects of his character and stuff as, feeding into your creative process. And that approach was very reassuring for me right out of the gate. I was like, okay, this guy cares about what he's doing. He is fitting this work to the world and he's actually familiar with it. And just to have that right out the gate on the first few songs was a big reassurance to me. I'm like, okay, I feel like I'm in really good hands here with this production. Um,
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I think I just keep coming back to the idea that it was just a really enjoyable experience. In order to so to get the opportunity to um write thematic material, Howard Shore style, and just have that emotive link where you can just write themes about characters and not have to worry about, other practical realities is a blessing that, most composers chew their right arm off to get. So it was a really enjoyable experience to be able to just look at these characters, write themes for these people. And I know some of them I'm immortal, but still, you still look at them from a humanistic point of view because they still have sides of humanity, both good and bad, interwoven into their personalities. And I think that's the point, the way that human beings interact with the various deities in so much as those deities actually represent all the different sides of humanities, and that's why they worship, that's how they choose to worship, whoever they decide to worship. Really, really emphasizes the point that actually all of these deities have human characteristics to them, and that made it a really enjoyable experience to try to bring that out in their music themes.
Absolutely. Something that was kind of fun about that was like when I was looking at, different names to send you for the track list, I was incorporating little quotes from the script that were fitted to each different character. And I just kind of got a kick out of that step just because I was like figuring out, okay, what is, this theme is about this character, but what is it about that character that I want to really harp on? And that just was kind of a fun thing. But something about doing the themes versus the really structured second by second thing that was nice about this project was it's 7 hours long, probably, roughly in that area. And the songs are going to be used multiple times. So there's a lot more forgiveness for that flow. Like the sound designer is going to be spacing out the lines between different characters. He's going to be structuring sound effects. So he can shift and pivot and work around the music elements and still make them really well fitted in a way that film doesn't offer that opportunity. So it was the themes that you used were felt to me like they would be very, very well fitted to that structure.
Oh, brilliant. And that's, part of the enjoyment of doing it because I didn't have that worry. But at the same time, it was a slightly different challenge because I needed to make sure that I couldn't just completely detach myself from the realities of the script. I had to make sure that you had enough material and enough varied material within a theme, that the sound designer could then take segments of the theme as, standalone subsections of that theme potentially, and put them in those various places. So the themes did need to make sure that they had a structure to them that allowed the sound designer to take sections and place them where they were needed. And at the same time, I was also conscious of, having a read through the script, especially when the first instances of the themes were going to take place, and just think about what was going on in my mind and try to visualize that script. And I did think about what would fit under those scenes as well. So it was a kind of a duality between giving enough variety and sometimes also trying to think about what is going on in the scene to make sure that what I was giving you it wasn't just a bunch of themes, it was actually also tailored to what was going on in the script somewhat.
For sure. And like some of the tracks, like specifically Ingway's theme, like that was one of the requests I made for that one, but also other songs like Mercy's song and A Brown Not Meant for Crowns and the Scene 4 introductions, like all of those songs, you could pick out elements where it's like, okay, here's a clean break where I could cut in here and take this portion and underlay here and shift it around freely without in any way damaging the track
Mm.
and give the sound designer room to work with that. So that was really nice. Something that is really important to me in different soundtracks is something you mentioned earlier, the leitmotifs that Howard Shore uses in Lord of the Rings, that he's able to kind of like recur elements, and a lot of famous soundtracks have elements of that with like say The Godfather, where the main theme and the love theme kind of mirror each other really closely in their openings, even though they have wildly different moods. And I felt some elements of that in this production. There were things that I noted that there's ties here, but I didn't have the technical know-how to like put my finger on what am I sensing. Were there any particular threads that went across different songs that you were like, these are things that linked this that in your production?
Yeah, absolutely. So, whilst everybody had their own theme, I felt it was really important that there'd just be a unifying sound that really kind of ran across everything. So, some of the chord progressions, and the way they're used in the kind of strings and brass, there were similarities and common threads that really came across all of the leitmotifs. And you're quite right to kind of quote Howard Shore again. It's kind of really in that model of using certain musical techniques that reoccur, but in different contexts. So they are individualistic, they are different and tailored to whoever they might be about. But yet at the same time, you always feel like this is one body of work, this is one unified world, and your book and 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 future books as well. You're unifying this world, and it's important that every kind of artistic creation that supports what you're doing also unifies your world.
Yeah. Even a couple of the pieces like A Brow Not Meant for Crowns and Forget Me Nots were both departures in that they used completely different instrumentations from the others, and they had a different sound in that they were very medieval in their kind of like I'm blanking on the proper words, but in their style they sounded medieval,
Yeah.
but they still didn't feel out of place either, and they still fit within that overall
Mm.
body. And I was really impressed by that you're able to manage the consistency of sound across even the dramatic departures. Like same thing with I Prefer to Embrace, kind of like that
Mm.
evil, dark, sinister song for the main villain character. It had electric elements, it had different sounds to it than anything else in the production, but it still fit, it still had its place, and I was really, really pleased.
Oh, excellent. I mean, just looping back to things like A Brown Not Meant for Crowns, I think it was different in so much as it was using something that was supposed to be authentically of the time, of the story. And I think that's why it had a departure from most of the other themes. But from a musical point of view, I tried to make that kind of almost quasi-Celtic um, sound infused throughout all of the themes. Whether they were using a lute or whether they were just using kind of modern day orchestral instruments, that idea, that musical language of that style, as you say, kind of almost similar to Last of the Mohicans in thinking about that Indian tribal sound, and then thinking about potentially that Celtic medieval sound. That musical language, I think, was consistent throughout virtually all of the themes. So when you did get something that was really of the time, using an instrument of the time, like A Brow Not Meant for Crowns, it didn't feel out of place because that language is there in most of the other themes, even if it's not as kind of obvious as it is in that theme.
Interesting. Was there a favorite piece of yours to work on in the production? Like across the suite, was there anyone that you were like, this one I feel like I really achieved what I wanted to, or I just like it as a song?
I think probably I hadn't actually thought of that until now, but the one that really pops into my head is the Looking Glass, which was Vanity's theme. I
Okay, yeah.
really enjoyed working with this idea that this slippery, seductive character, but yet at the same time really has a dark side to his personality. And that was a really fun thing to kind of evoke in music, because you start off with this kind of Persian duduk solo, which
Mhm.
has got this kind of sonorous, almost snake charmer-like sound, and it fuses with a flute. But then there's really kind of disturbing dissonant notes that comes in on under the dark brass chords that develop later on. And I felt like it was an interesting piece of music, but it also kind of represented a really multifaceted character.
Was very surprised when I started playing that one. Like of all the different pieces, I started playing that and I was like, oh, well, that's different. It's got kind of like an Eastern, like you said, Persian sounds to it. I
Yeah,
was like, I like this. It's got like a decadent feel. And then as you
yeah.
move further into it, it's got that sharper edge. And I was like, nice,
Mm.
it works. Um,
Yeah. I also really enjoyed working on Mercy's theme, because got the fiddle player in for that, and it was a really kind of emotive Celtic floral kind of piece, but at the same time it had a simplicity to it. You know, a recurring two-chord motif that really is at the heart of it, but you really kind of encapsulated that tender empathy that Mercy has.
Yeah, it made a very good mirror to Ingwe's theme as well. Like those two pieces are kind of like structurally probably the most important to the production. And they mirror each other in a way that's very nice. Like, because when Mercy's theme gets to its more intense portions, it does so in a very measured, soft way. And then when Ingwe's gets to his more intense portions, it's kind of more of a rise upward in majesty. And
Mm,
it really says a lot just about their characters, just the way the progression happens.
yeah.
I like that. So if anyone's listening to this or listening to the project and they really enjoy your music and they want to learn more about your music, look up stuff you have out, or perhaps there's somebody looking to hire a composer, where can they find out more about you? Like, where would they go?
So they could go to my website, which is just basically www.michaelhyman. So that's MichaelHyman.co.uk. And that's obviously got my back catalogue in, things I've worked on. They can also look me up on Spotify and Amazon Music if you want to listen to anything that I've released as a composer artist. They can check me out on IMDb if there's any directors on there who want to have a look at my film history and things like that. So, or just kind of find me on social media, find me on LinkedIn or Instagram, and just send me a message, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, well, like it's interesting because I was not initially planning on hiring a composer for this project. I was looking at my options and I'm like, I gotta figure out what's within my reach, what's best within my reach. And I was just gonna go to a website like Soundstripe or something and access their library. And I'm very glad I didn't. I am very glad I did hire you, but you reached out to me, and that was very interesting. I was like, the fact that this person just saw this listing and gave it a shot, and then I looked up, your website and your IMDb and the different things you've worked on. I was really blown away. I was like, this is really cool just to have by on my end happenstance made this connection.
Yeah.
I was very serendipitous. If they wanted to listen to what you consider your very best work, what would be your favorite thing to recommend? Like, if they want to go listen to something that I thought was good.
So the best thing to do is either go on to Spotify or Amazon Music and look me up and look at anything I've released on that. On my website, there is a listen to page, so you can listen to some of my previous soundtrack stuff. I do have a kind of best of playlist, but it's actually a SoundCloud playlist. It could be private actually. So if anybody wants to listen to that, they just send me a message and I can give you a link to my audio highlights. And I also have a visual show reel as well. If people if people like what they hear on my website and like what they hear on kind of Spotify, if they either send me an email at info@michaelhyman.co.uk, which is the email address on my website, or if they kind of got in touch on LinkedIn or Instagram, I can then send you kind of a link to my audio and visual highlights reels and things like that.
Perfect. And so I've been closing out each of these interviews, just kind of asking a couple like friendly get to know you type questions. I've been asking like favorite books or movies or anything. So for you, I think I'll ask, what's your favorite soundtrack?
Wow. That's going to be a challenging one to think of off of the top of my head, because there are just so many that I enjoy for so many different reasons. So I'm going to have to say Vertigo by Bernard Herrmann. I'm going to give you three. Vertigo by Bernard, and they're all completely different. Vertigo by Bernard Herrmann, The Return of the King, and also a really obscure experimental film called Under the Skin, which has a really kind of weird quasi-electronic, but also acoustic instruments done in weird way. Soundtrack by a composer called Misha Levy.
Definitely three very distinct styles there. And who's your favorite composer?
Um, is that just film composer or just
Just in
overall
general,
composer?
like music.
Um, Probably a composer called Maurice Ravel, who's an early 20th century French composer. Film composer, probably Howard Shore overall on the balance of things, though there's so many different people who I really enjoy. And I'm trying to think of somebody who's a bit more contemporary. Um, I'll have to get back to you on the third one. But those
Fair
guys,
enough. Well, I think that was it for me. That was really, really cool to talk to you, get to learn a little bit about your process and your background and stuff. And I have been just blown away with the quality of your work on this project, and I cannot wait to hear it all cut together and put into the project. And I really appreciate it.
oh, I can't wait to hear it either. I'm really looking forward to when it comes out and listening to the whole thing. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that I reached out. I'm looking at these listings sometimes, and just ever so often something just speaks to me, and I just think, you know what, I'll just drop that guy a line, and I'm really happy that I did.
Appreciate it. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.